Welcome, everyone. Tonight we are sharing 5 top facts about the resurrection as revealed through the research at the International Institute of Pneumatology. I would like to invite everyone to go to kingdompurposeradio.com and sign in on the chat so that we can chat with you during this live if you would like that. And so, without further ado, let's get this intro going.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a place where joy knows no bounds, where inspiration reigns supreme, and where the clock strikes happiness every time it chimes. Get ready to embark on a journey of spiritual enlightenment and divine motivation with none other than your radiant host, the beacon of positivity, the one and only Happy Patti. This is Happy O'Clock, the radio show and podcast that's not just a broadcast, but a celebration of life, love, and the miraculous. Patti Sutton, affectionately known as Happy Patti, is your guide on this uplifting expedition, diving deep into the realms of healing. Testimonies that defy the ordinary and the unshakable power found within the pages of the Holy Scriptures. This is not just a show, it's an oasis of encouragement, where we believe that in every circumstance, there's an opportunity for transformation. Tune in, not just with your ears, but with your heart wide open, as we explore the supernatural encounters in Christ that spark hope, ignite faith, and leave you breathless with the wonders of the divine. Welcome to a world where the clock always strikes Happy O'Clock.
Very, very nice.
Someone really special made that for me.
It's the
Thank
first
you
time
very much.
I'm experiencing that live. It's awesome. I like it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'd like to say happy Monday and welcome to the Happy O'Clock Radio Talk Show. My name is Patti Sutton, and I'm also known as Happy Patti. I'm your host tonight, coming to you from Valdosta, Georgia, and I'm a master mentor with the Zane Pierre International Institute of Pneumatology, a prison minister and office administrator. And now I am over the top excited once again to get to introduce the one and only Minister Zane Pierre. He is the president and founder, headmaster trainer of the ZKI International Institute of Pneumatology and Anointed Life Mentorship International. He is an author, translator, speaker, and creative digital designer. So welcome to Happy O'Clock.
I am excited to be here, especially to speak on the topic that we're actually going to be speaking on, because it's a topic that is a topic that, or the understanding of the topic, it's something that has grown to be close to my heart, and I wish that all believers would actually come into the understanding of that and begin to experience it as well. So I am really excited to be here and to be in the same room with the great and radiant radio personality. Happy Patti.
Thank you very much. Very, very much. I appreciate that. And we were just talking a little bit ago about, the topic being on resurrection. And even though, Easter, we celebrated Easter last Sunday, but actually Sunday a week ago, but it's still relevant every single day.
Yes, it is. It is.
And the 5 top points that you're going to make are and can be life-changing for those with ears to hear that will, tune in and pay attention, and you will be blown away. It's like,
yes.
It's great stuff that you put out, Zane, and I'm very thankful for it. I will say that.
I'm humbled by that, Holy Sister, and I also want to add that what we're going to speak about here tonight is this is not a theological deduction or conclusion. This is something that I've actually actively put into practical use, and I'm seeing healing for a few people well by merely applying the dynamics of the resurrection. The resurrection is something that we have treated abstractly, we treated it as an event. But the apostles, Yeshua, they didn't treat it as an event. They treated it as something that they can apply, that mindset that they are applying. And I've seen that mindset work miracles right in front of me, from healing and other miraculous things. So this is in no form or fashion an attempt to change anyone's theological position, but a challenge really to take the mindset of the resurrection, how it is applied, and go apply it yourself, and then come back and talk to us. Well,
Right.
that's what we say.
Because yeah, we're not trying to force feed anyone, but putting the information out there and give you an opportunity to see how it works.
Yeah. And see it work for yourself. You don't have to believe us. Yeah.
If you can't
This is
apply it, what
the
good
thing
is
about
it?
100%. If you can't
Yeah.
apply it, it's just data that you're holding in your mind and you're adding to your library. And our life in Christ is supposed to be a dramatically life-giving one, where we don't fear
And who
death.
needs a library with dust, right?
That is what we say. And I like the connection that you made there. A library with dust.
Huh? Well, look at here. Boom.
Yes.
I just put up a graphic. If you can't see this, if you're on the radio, if you would like to go to kingdompurposeradio.com, you can see the graphic that is up here on the screen. I invite you to do that so that you can more than hear, you can also see.
Amen.
Right.
So, do we get started?
Yes, I was going to say, you ready to get it going on here?
Born ready. I'm born ready. Resurrected ready.
You sure are. Absolutely.
So the great thing about what we are about to share tonight is this is not something that you have been familiar with. For most of you who are actually tuning in, what I'm about to speak on here tonight is dramatically different from anything that you've heard. This is actually birthed out of our research at the International Institute of Pneumatology. And what we have done at the Institute is actually gone back to the ancient Israelite perspective of the scriptures, how they understood it, how they applied it, and how they would have actually seen the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his crucifixion as well as his resurrection. And so what separates what we're about to speak about here tonight from anything that you've ever heard is that what we are about to cover is something that you can practically apply in your life as a mindset, as a mental posture. What you've heard before has actually provided you with cultural data, historical data. You've heard about the event, and we've reverenced the event in the Western Christian culture. But I don't think I can say that I have encountered anyone that has taught how does one apply this event practically to your life to be able to see the resurrection power manifest. All right?
And who wouldn't want the resurrection power to manifest?
If you are a believer, then that should be your greatest priority, because this is what the whole concept of being a follower of Jesus Christ is based on. That you died with him and you resurrected with him. And therefore, the same things that he did when he resurrected, which is appear in rooms, disappear from places, appear differently to different people, and even ascended. All of these things are revelations of what we are able to do. And we want to be able to know how he applied the understanding of his resurrection and how his apostles applied it to be able to do the things that they do, so that we can actually experience heaven on earth as the resurrection was intended for you to be able to experience. All right. Now, the first thing that we actually have to talk about here with regards to how you're approaching the resurrection is understanding that there is a massive difference between what we call the westernized perspective of biblical literature and the ancient Israelite perspective of biblical literature, right? Which is what we call the Greco-Roman civilization or the Western civilization and the ancient Israelite civilization. Now, when we say the Greco-Roman civilization, we're actually speaking about the system of thought or the school of thought that is predominantly guiding how we think in the Greco-Roman civilization, which is predominantly very abstract, right? The difference with that, when we say the ancient Israelite civilization, notice I'm not saying the ancient Hebrews, but the ancient Israelite. There's a difference. The ancient Hebrews, historically speaking, are the descendants of one of Abraham's great grandfathers, which is Heber, and he had many different children. And so the Israelites are a lineage of children from Heber. So we can say that all Israelites are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Israelites. And what separates the Israelites from the rest of the Hebrews is that they came into a covenant with Yahweh, and they specifically were required to physically circumcise, which represented the cutting off of the animal skin that God put on man outside of the garden, which was a symbolic act behind the decision to reject all external sources of wisdom, using external things and creation as a source of validation, and to be birthed in the covenant in the name Yahweh that was given to man in the garden. So this separates the Israelites as a circumcised community. They're known as a circumcised community amongst the rest of the world, which is understood to be the uncircumcised community, having no knowledge of the name. Now, the difference between the Western civilization's perspective of Scripture and the ancient Israelite civilization is that the Western civilization works with a very abstract system of thought, which means we do not connect concepts to physical, tangible things. Our concepts are actually open to interpretation, and what we do, because we don't use tangible items in creation to be able to connect our concepts to, we tend to fall back on using our emotions to define what that concept is. So, for example, if I say this person has great strength, because that is not something that is connected to something that is tangible for one to experience. If I have 100 persons sitting in a room and I say, hey, define strength, no one will be able to know where to start. Your definition will be based on your own experience, and you use primarily your emotions to fill in the rest of that meaning. So strength for me in the Western culture and strength for Holy Sister Patti, for example, would be two different things.
And if you had 10 people in the room, you could possibly have 10 different definitions.
10 different definitions. Even if I tell them draw it, you'll have 10 different drawings.
Mm-hmm. Oh, especially if you draw it. Yeah.
Right. The difference with the ancient Israelite civilization is that there's no concept that they refer to that is not tied to something that is tangible, that can be experienced by the five senses. So, for example, if I say leadership or leader, they're usually referred to the horns of a bull. And everybody in that culture, when they say leader, everybody would think about the horns, because the horns of the bull amongst the herd, you'd always be able to identify where the bull is when it raises its head, because you could see the horn above the rest of the cattle. So that's an example of something tangible. They also attribute leadership to the deer, and how the deer in particular, the stag, pretty much is very, very keen with regards to his environment to guide the group in safety and to make sure that they are safe by looking out to make sure that there is no dangers around. And so everybody's mind, when they refer to these concepts, goes right back to that. And so everybody has the same idea that the stag stands with his chest out and he's observing the environment. So this is basically what they expect the leader to do. In our culture, we don't have these tangible connections, so we use our history to formulate the idea, and then we fill in the rest of the definition with feelings. Now, why are we speaking about this here? It's because most of us have been taught to read the Bible through the abstract perspective.
It's subjective.
It's subjective,
Mm.
where there's nothing in the Bible that is not experienceable by the five senses. Every concept is tied to something. And this applies to the resurrection. Most of us have a very abstract and subjective perspective of the resurrection. We think about it in our mind. We imagine Jesus in us. We imagine the resurrection, but it is not really connected to something that we don't have we don't have something that is actually tangible to explain to us what that means. And the physical resurrection in particular is in itself something tangible. But what happens is that once we have the tangible understanding of what the resurrection is connected to, we need now to be able to identify how we apply that according to scripture. Right? So we have the physical connection, but we don't know how to do that. So we continue to apply these very abstract and subjective understandings of the resurrection. Whereas in the scriptures, once there's a tangible reference point, there must be an understanding of how that is applied practically. Now, if you were in Israel, in the ancient Israel, the priests in particular, they were very much aware of how one functions inside of the garden, taking on God's name, and how one functions outside of the garden. For those of you who have read the scriptures and you've noticed the words circumcised and uncircumcised in the Old Testament, the circumcised perspective was in reference to how you approached from within the garden, and the uncircumcised would be those who were outside of the garden. Now, the difference here is very, very simple and could sound very profound. Outside of the garden, all concepts that you're approaching, because outside of the garden is actually the priority is the desert, which is dust. Every single concept that you encounter, you try to apply some level of physicality to it to be able to understand it. So, for example, if we say love, some persons would actually say, well, there's affection, physicality, buying gifts, physicality, being quality time, physicality. All concepts outside of the garden use dust as the priority to find meaning to the concept. All right? Inside of the garden, on the other hand, does not deal with dust. It is where we function from the spirit. And therefore, all concepts use spirit. And what that means is that whatever the concept is, it is in reference to a mindset, a mental posture that you are applying. So if you apply love to the garden, love will not take on any physical attachment, but it would be a mindset of equity for all of God. And since God is all and in all, that means you treat all creation with the same priority of giving it life, cultivating and maintaining life. That's so primarily outside of the garden, you focus on the physicality. Inside of the garden, we focus on how or what mindset is that referring to be able to apply practically. This then brings us to the resurrection. Most of us have actually been taught the resurrection as an event, physicality, dust. So we speak about it as an event. We worship the fact that Jesus did this. We even think about the crucifixion as the event. We discuss the event. And we try to put meaning to what this event could mean. If you're looking at the crucifixion and the resurrection from the garden, we're actually looking at what does the crucifixion represent mentally as a mindset, and what does the resurrection mean as a mindset. And within the garden, what the crucifixion means is actually understood to be is the death of the knowledge of good and evil, and the results of that, which is sickness, mental health issues, and death. The death to that, the death to all of those things, and the resurrection in life, which means any idea. The Apostle Paul in Hebrews chapter 10 said that Jesus' death was the sprinkling of the blood on the conscience of man from all evil, which means it was sprinkled on the conscience to purge your mind and heart of death and all things related to death and the mindset of death, which is what we call the knowledge of good and evil. And in practical terms, that means the elimination of using any external creation as a source of wisdom. And the resurrection, therefore, is being applied here now by a mindset, which means the mindset that is life with the absence of death, the death of double-mindedness. Right? Now, most of us have been taught, I just want to place this here as well. Most of us have been taught that man's decision in the garden caused him to separate himself from God. And even though that is a common understanding, that is something that is actually born in the Western Christian community. That's a Western Christian struggle. The Bible does not refer to separation from God in any form or fashion. The conundrum in the Bible is double-mindedness, not choosing your source of wisdom and being one spirit. Now, when we say one spirit, what we basically mean by that is gravity is a law of physics, right? Gravity, pretty much, to the risk of oversimplifying this, let's say gravity is the law that says what goes up must come down. So you throw anything up in the air, it comes back down. You could say that the law of gravity represents what it means to be single-minded. Single-eyed or single-minded, to function as one spirit. What goes up must come down. That's all. Anything you throw up in the air, it's coming back down.
No other options.
No other option. Right? It does not go left or right. What goes up in the air must come back down. Gravity represents how you're supposed to think about life. And the thoughts of death, which could be thoughts going left and right, there is no option or no possible consideration of that. What goes up must come down. Whatever is happening is to cultivate and to maintain life. So we don't even see death. What we see is this needs the full measure of life. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be cultivated. All right.
So if you see something that doesn't have full life, then you see it as it needs life applied
to return to the full measure of life.
Yeah. Okay.
The Apostle Paul makes it. He communicates it in his letter to the Ephesians by saying the full measure of Christ. You bring it to the full measure of Christ to bring it to the full measure of life.
Okay.
Right? So that's actually my first point. Point number one. The resurrection was not meant to be discussed as an event that took place. Yes, it took place. But the resurrection was meant for practical application.
It's deeper than an event.
It's much deeper than an event. It's something that you take on as a posture.
Mm-hmm.
And so sacrifices in the Bible, most of us have been taught that sacrifices were meant to appease God. And you may be surprised to know that that's a very Greek and Roman way of thinking of sacrifices. You did sacrifices in the Greek and Roman culture to appease the God that you are addressing, so that this God, you'll have favor with this God. The ancient Israelites did not use sacrifices as a means of appeasing God. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3 into 4, you'll notice that sacrifices was actually the response to man being locked outside of the garden. The first sacrifices being presented, they were burnt offerings. And what that was, it meant, again, at the risk of oversimplifying this, what it meant was the use of the animal to put to death that which was in man that should not be there, hindering him from getting back into the garden. So sacrifices was the response to put to death that which was in man that was hindering him from re-entering the garden. Right? Now, for those of you who hear this for the first time, you can actually compare Adam being locked outside, then he has his twin sons, Cain and Abel, and their response to what happened in chapter 3 was sacrifice after they were locked out. And there was a flaming sword and cherubim. It was blocking them. The sword represented the division of knowledge of good and evil from God's knowledge, and the fire represented the consumption of the knowledge of good and evil so that they can re-enter in the garden through God's knowledge. This is also repeated where Moses builds the tabernacle, which is the physical model of the garden. And just as man was locked out of the garden, Moses is locked out of his garden. Moses and Israel. And God's response to get them back into the garden is the book of Leviticus, which are sacrifices of fire. So sacrifices here means the sacrifice of the knowledge of good and evil. And the fire is the consumption of the knowledge of good and evil on that altar. Right? So which means the sacrifices in particular means the purging. This is why the Bible says it. Jesus purged you of sin. He purged you of sin, but he not only purged you of sin, Paul actually explains that Jesus' sacrifice was a burnt offering, not only a sin offering, but also burnt offering and peace offering, guilt offering, and thanksgiving. What are specific to those who are outside of the circumcised Israelites was mainly burnt offering and peace offering. So the burnt offering for us who are not of the circumcised community meant the death of death, sicknesses and diseases and infirmities, its nature, its will, and death in the body. Right? It's the name, its nature, its will, and death in the body. So when we approach the resurrection, the practical application of that is the acknowledgement that death died. It was put to death. Sicknesses and infirmities died. Death in your body was put to death. And now you return to single-mindedness because your conscience has been purged from evil, purged from death, and now you are actually walking in life. And the application of life as was instructed in the garden, which was to cultivate and to maintain life. So from that perspective, you don't see the person may say, I'm sick, and the doctor says this. You don't see all of that. That's not relevant to you. What you see is life, and if the person is not well, then they need life, and you're restoring them to the fullness of life. Yeah?
Okay.
Nice. So
following that.
So this actually is where, well, so hold on, I kind of went forward there. So on the last slide, I covered slide number 2.
Yeah.
So slide number 1 is, or page number 1 is, right? Page 1 is life. For you to understand life, you must understand the crucifixion, which represented death, the death of death, Hebrews chapter 2. So this is something that you practically apply. You begin to lose the awareness of death and begin to see the creation through life. If you look at the garden and the New Jerusalem, you'll notice that the garden does not have darkness in it, nor death. So it doesn't even say, and it was even, and there was morning and there was night. It says there was evening and there's morning, because the garden represents the acknowledgement of greater light and lesser light. It does not acknowledge darkness.
Wow.
And the New Jerusalem is a reflection of this, and it comes out plainly in the New Jerusalem, Revelation 21 and 22, and says that in the city there is no darkness there and no fear of evil, which means you as a believer must now drop the idea of death and all of the things that we were taught, which is all from the medical science and all of these things. We call it knowledge. This is actually knowledge that God did not give you. you're returning to life and light. And anything that is so life in the garden is actually defined as through the garden interpretation of the Bible, which is not Western interpretation. The garden interpretation of the Bible identifies that life is defined as that which is necessary, or the energy necessary to move and to reproduce life self-sufficiently. So for us, where someone is not moving via sickness, we see that they need to get what is necessary to move and to reproduce life self-existently or self-sufficiently. And if you think
would
about
you
it,
say that the reason
Mhm.
people don't do this is because they don't have the knowledge? They don't realize that this
it is
is
not
what happened. They don't understand the
it
resurrection.
is not
Is
taught.
that why?
Yeah,
Okay, so it's not taught. So it goes back to that. My people perish for lack of knowledge.
for a lack of knowledge.
Okay,
They
all
perish
right.
for a lack of
So
knowledge.
I just wanted to kind of point that out, because with all this being true, then why do we have all this, death and sickness and all this going on? It's because of lack of knowledge.
Because we have not been taught that this is something that you apply and not something that you just acknowledge.
Okay.
And so, like for most of us in particular, one of the things that I just mentioned there, then I said this in a master series just recently, it has never been taught in Western Christian culture that when a sacrifice is done, you have a responsibility to the sacrifice. So, for example, we have acknowledged that Jesus was sacrificed. We acknowledge it. But if you go into the scriptures where a sacrifice is done, the offer of the sacrifice has a responsibility to the sacrifice. So if for example, let's say we were doing a sacrifice, this is not an actual sacrifice in the Bible, I'm using this as an example.
Okay.
Let's say somebody was doing a sacrifice for sadness. Once the sacrifice was done for sadness, the offerer, having put to death the sadness through the animal, the offerer then has a responsibility to put on joy to represent
Okay,
that
then.
sadness died.
So the
Right?
sacrifice of death has been done. So we have a responsibility to put on life.
To put on life. This is not taught in Western
Okay.
culture in response to your question.
Okay, then.
You literally were supposed to put on joy and it was a responsibility because his sacrifice meant death to sadness. Sadness died. And you
Okay.
now put on joy and no longer attribute or cut or
No longer have a
you know
mindset of being sad.
you're no longer even acknowledging that sadness is alive. It's gone. It's dead. Right?
And even if you start to have that emotion come up and you say, no, that's not right. That's not right, because
You
that's dead.
you hold yourself responsible to the sacrifice.
Okay.
Yes. So you hold on to that and continue to function in that. And when you do that, that's where the power comes from. Right? Because now you're functioning single-mindedly. You're not double-minded about whether sadness or I should feel sad. You treat it as though it does not exist.
Okay.
Right? This is why you go to Revelation 21 and it says, and there is no more death, because you treat it as though it does not exist. So to understand the fullness of the resurrection, you have to understand that the crucifixion meant death to death and all fruits of death, which is the name, the nature, the will, and death to death in your body. Now, to understand that, we must understand the sacrifice, which is what we were speaking about just a while ago. Let's move this forward. Right. So to understand the crucifixion, you must understand the sacrifice. And the sacrifice, which is what we just mentioned in response to your question, we were not taught that sacrifices was not to please God. We were taught that in the Western culture that's based on the Greeks and the Romans' understanding of sacrifice, which is the pursuit of validation before God. In the ancient Israelite culture, sacrifices were understood to be the death of whatever the sacrifice was done for. So if Yeshua put to death, he put to death the name, the nature, the will, and death in the body, fully consumed as the burnt offering. That means that you have a responsibility to acknowledge that death died, and now you are a life-giving individual, a life-being creature, and even your mind and imagination gives creation what is necessary to move and to reproduce life self-sufficiently. Now, to understand the sacrifices even more, we need to go back to where it started, which is with regards to Cain and Abel. Now, most of us have been taught, again, the dust aspect of these things. So we were taught that the sacrifice was actually done when we were speaking about the sacrifice. Just as the resurrection, we taught about the crucifixion as an event. We taught about the idea of sacrifice as something that happened, which is outside of the garden perspective, using dust to understand it. We never were taught how that applied inside the garden, which is the mindset of that which is sacrificed, that which was sacrificed is now dead. And same thing with Cain and Abel. We read this narrative as an event, like something that happened, which is the dust, the desert perspective. We were not taught how do we view that from the garden. What is the mindset that this represents? And so Cain and Abel, this event took place, and so we know that Cain killed Abel. They presented sacrifices or offerings before God. God respected Abel's offering. He did not respect Cain. Cain, off of his anger, Cain killed Abel, went into a state of fear and distress, and then left Eden. Then later on, in chapter 4, we see God replacing Abel with Seth. Mm-hmm. Right? What does this mean as a mindset? If you've never really again, this is not something that is taught. And if you've never really sat down and give it thought, this is what the story of Cain and Abel means. Cain and Abel represents two responses to Adam becoming double-minded and actually beginning to die. It represents two responses. Cain represents the response of being dust-minded, which means he's not aware of spirit, and so he is pursuing life and validation outside of himself. Cain means to acquire, which means you are acquiring more things of creation and more dust to build your respect and to create an identity. Yeah? Which is technically what the man in the garden, what the man did that caused him to fall outside of the garden. He began to try to acquire wisdom outside of himself. Abel represents the response of understanding that one cannot gather what one cannot reproduce naturally. You cannot gather anything in any amount of dust to create a new identity or to create an identity or to get life. Cain actually represents the understanding that to have life and abundance, one must return to the name and to the spirit that God gave man in the garden. So you'll notice that Cain brings his sweat from the fruit of the ground, which is what God told the man after his name change. In chapter 3, he said that from the sweat of your brow, you will eat food from the ground. So Cain represents presenting sweat, which is presenting to God your performance. Whilst Abel understands that it is not how much he performs, it is the death to the spirit that his father took on. that his father pretty
The
much gave
animal
birth
spirit.
to, the animal spirit, to actually retake the name of the man in the garden. So Cain uses an animal representing the nature of the animal that the man got from the serpent, which was an animal. It represented the death to the animal spirit, its name, its nature, its will, and its presence in the body. And then what they would do after the burnt offering is call upon the name, summoning the spirit of Yahweh in them, so that what Yahweh says can now multiply from them after their own kind. All right. So if you are actually looking at Jesus' resurrection, then you are viewing it through Abel's understanding, which is death to one spirit and resurrection in a new spirit. If you are
In
approaching
the
the
garden
resurrection
spirit.
in the garden spirit, which is
Okay.
the spirit of Christ, Yahweh in flesh, again.
Mm-hmm.
So now you are back into the garden, and life is reproduced from you after your own kind. That's where your ability and the power to heal, cast out devils, raise the dead comes from. You identify with the spirit of life to reproduce life. If you are approaching the resurrection from outside of the garden, then you are not aware that you need to identify with a different spirit. What you are doing is doing more, increasing performance to validate yourself before God so that He can give you life outside of you. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
All right.
And I see Cain as he was jealous of Abel. That comparison thing.
Well,
It's comparing the outward, the things that are
outward performance.
subjective and that, yes, out of performance. Exactly.
Outward performance. He presented his performance and his sweat before God for God's respect. And Cain presents the death of the nature that God did not give them to take on the name of to take on the name and the spirit that was given in the garden to begin with.
Okay.
And so even that, you would not even understand that until you go back to the garden and understand that the reason for death or the catalyst for death in the garden, Cain and Abel, will not be understood clearly until you understand that man was created with the name Yahweh in the garden. And so if he's created with the name Yahweh, Yahweh is the spirit that is also called the breath of life. He was told to not switch his source of wisdom because his spirit is his wisdom and was his wisdom. The spirit has a nature, and the nature of that spirit is the wisdom of that spirit. Just like the nature of every animal is its wisdom. That spirit has a nature, that nature guides how that animal thinks. It's the wisdom of that animal. The nature of the Spirit of God in man was his wisdom. When man chose to identify wisdom outside of himself and to pursue it outside of himself, it was an acknowledgement that he had no life and wisdom in him. And so he was pursuing life outside of him. Which means, inadvertently, that means that if life is outside of him, he's actually identifying as death, pursuing life. Which is why the gospel's message is Christ in you. Is a response to that issue where you stop pursuing life outside of you and start living from life in you, your life-giving spirit. Right? So Cain and Abel pretty much understands that one cannot pursue life. To have life, one has to be life, to reproduce life. So by understanding the difference, then you'll understand that even in the world today, the believers are the ones who acknowledge Abel's understanding, which is one has to put to death the spirit, one acknowledges that Jesus put it to death, and he's given you a new spirit to be life. And the gospel is being preached to those out there who believe that they can pursue and gather to get life.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much Abel is preaching to Cain in the world today. As it was in Jesus' time, the Pharisees represented Cain. Jesus and his disciples were the Abel lineage. And so from that perspective, therefore, we must understand that, again, this comes back to how does one apply the resurrection? And if we come back to this, then we know that the resurrection, therefore, is not something that you see from outside of the garden as an event. It is something that you apply. And the application is here the absence of death from your mind, its name, its nature, its will or its wisdom, and the absence of death from your body. And return to the garden where life is the only perspective. And therefore, anything that outside of the garden calls sick, inside of the garden just says we need to bring it back up to its fullness of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that which is called death outside of the garden. This is why in Jesus' time and even Paul, they say that the person is sleeping because there is no acknowledgement of death. They're sleeping and you are waking them back up.
And they
in
need
life.
to wake up.
Exactly.
They need some spirit in them. They need a breath of life.
Exactly.
Get up. Yeah.
So there's no acknowledgement of death anymore. They're sleeping.
So if someone's
and you
sick, and someone says they're sick, we don't see them as sick. We see them as
requiring
lacking,
life.
That they're not full of life. So they need fullness of life.
They need to be refilled.
Be refilled. And we
this
pour
is,
out our spirit to them.
So this is actually explained in the blessing of man in the garden. Be fruitful, multiply the spirit upon them, replenish with life. Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish with life. And
so that's what that means, actually?
Yes, that's what that means.
Okay.
You replenish life. All right? Because they may not actually understand the resurrection, and they may be living by the pursuit of life, which is causing them to fall sick because they're not living from the life inside, they're pursuing the life outside. And so you and I, now understanding the life inside, we can now be fruitful by deciding to give them life. We multiply and replenish them with life.
Okay. We multiply our spirit.
Yep.
The spirit of life.
Which is Jesus' spirit. The Holy Spirit,
yes.
You're multiplying. You see evidence of this multiplication with the apostles in the New Testament, laying hands, and the Spirit comes upon. There's a multiplication of the Spirit upon them, from them. It's multiplied, and they begin to speak in tongues, so they are filled with life.
Gold or silver have I none, which is of the dust, right? But what I do have, I give to you. I have the spirit of life, and I pass that to you and fill you with that. You come to the fullness of life.
Now, to say that you have the spirit of life,
yes.
most of us, when we hear that, again, we fall back on abstract.
Okay. So how do we stop from doing that?
And the next thing is we use dust to try to explain, to understand what the spirit of life is. So most persons in our culture, using the dust, what they try to do is to create a mental picture to see what the spirit of life is. And where the spirit of life is not what you imagine with the dust. Is how is that applied as a mindset, as a function. And therefore the spirit of life means thoughts and visions of fullness of life. So just as in the Old Testament, where they would lay their hands on the animal and press their hands into the animal and confess their sin, they multiply that across there, they pass it across. It's a thought of their sin that they're confessing, which means they're seeing it in their mind. And then they pass that on the animal. You're doing the reverse now. You lay hands with you seeing them in the fullness of life, and you pass that on to them. and their body is restored to the fullness of life from the vision. So to say the spirit of life is to say visions of life or thoughts of life. This is something that you apply again.
Visions of life or thoughts of life as seeing them completely well?
Completely well.
Okay.
And not just well. According to the definition of life by the garden interpretation, is that which is necessary for them to move and to reproduce life self-sufficiently, which means this is visions of life with them moving and doing what they couldn't do.
So that's why you would tell them to do something that they couldn't do.
That's why Jesus would say, take up your bed and walk. He's telling them to move, which is giving them what they need to move and to self-determine and to reproduce life on their own.
Because the breath of life isn't stagnant, it moves.
The breath of life comes from the word breath in Genesis, comes from the root word that means thought. So when we say the breath of life, it means the thoughts of life, visions, mental pictures of life.
All right.
Make sense?
Yes. Good stuff.
So when you apply the resurrection to death to death, when you apply the resurrection to yourself now, that is basically seeing you moving and reproducing life, no matter what situation you're in. And you'll notice that when you make that decision and acknowledge that death does not exist. And
sickness does not exist.
It does not exist.
Because sickness leads to death. So we can't have a part of that.
Sickness leads to no movement. Sickness leads to limited movement until you stop moving, which is what we would call death outside of the garden. And so if we're back in the city, here's a very practical tip to walk in life here. You can start with something as simple as, in your mind, whatever you see in front of you that may be seeing what the garden or what Jesus put to death, if this is actually apparently showing you some evidence of that, you can make a decision in your mind and practically move death and imagine that death is outside of earth. And inside here is just life. And what God says is the only laws that exist. Because what God says in the Bible practically is what we call laws of physics. And if the laws of physics work here, then what is said in the Bible works the same way like laws of physics. So then you can practically imagine that death is outside of earth for a moment. So let's engage that practically. So I want you, Holy Sister, to just practically acknowledge that death is outside of the planet. It's outside of earth.
Okay.
And inside of earth,
evacuated.
It just gets extricated out. Boom.
Yes. Okay.
Right?
It's gone.
Because the blood sacrifice was done to extricate it. So it is extricated.
So it had to run out.
And inside of earth, it is only life. And what God says is the only thing that could happen.
Heaven on earth.
Heaven on earth. Heaven is here.
Okay.
And all death is outside of the city, outside of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to hold that thought for a moment. Start to see that in your mind. And see the difference that even your energy feels by just acknowledging
I feel
that.
the difference. Absolutely.
Now, choose something.
It's like a relief.
Right.
I'm feeling a relief.
It's a relief.
Like, whoo, I'm glad that's gone.
Right. Now, choose something in your life right now that you want to have life, which means you want to see it move and to reproduce life on its own, and command it to be filled with the fullness of life. And in this acknowledgement, if death is outside, then any delays or it not happening is also outside of the planet. The thought of it not happening is outside of the planet as well. So now I introduce you to what it means to walk in the full assurance of faith.
Mm.
That's outside the planet. And now you could be bold and in full assurance of faith and speak it. Whatever it is, just speak it. Tell it to be filled with the fullness of life, with the acknowledgement that it not happening, anything related to that is outside. Go ahead, speak.
I have to think of one. But yeah, that's a good example. I mean, anyone can do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's say, as an example, command all that's listening to be healed. And any
Okay.
thought of it not happening is outside the planet. So it's the only thing that could happen here is that what God says is going to happen.
Okay.
Like a law of physics.
Any and all listeners now or to the recording.
Be filled with the fullness of
Anything
life.
that is not of life, you must go.
Right?
Off
Outside.
the planet.
That gone outside.
Out of where you belong.
Right.
Go and be filled with life.
Amen.
The breath of life fill you.
Now, you see how your spirit resonating differently?
Yes, I can feel the flow of it.
You're feeling boldness as well. You're
Yes,
feeling power.
Yes.
This is how you apply the resurrection. No death. And now you just function in the fullness of life.
It's great.
Yeah? So that pretty much sums it up. Resurrection means the death of all alternatives and comparisons to life.
Amen.
Reproduce your spirit of life.
Anything else is double-mindedness, which we have no part of, and it's off this planet. Part of.
This is why in the garden, in the New Jerusalem, it says
yes,
that all darkness is outside of the city. That's how you're supposed to be living, as though there is no death here.
I love that example.
It's outside of the city. It's life inside of the city, but outside of the city. So I give you a simple, practical way of applying that, and you see the results.
So anyone listening, if you try this, let us know. This is pretty awesome. And Zane, before our time's about up, but if you within 30 to 40 seconds, if you could tell about the upcoming class you have on the name and how people can participate in that.
So for those of you who would like to join our free master series on the name, the ancient perspective of the name and how it is practically applied, go to www.patreon.com/Zane_EL_Fuego.
FUEGO.
FUEGO. Or go to Facebook to Anointed Life Mentorship INT. Anointed Life Mentorship INT. Free master series this weekend coming up Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 8 p.m.
You don't want to miss it. I'm telling you, it is very powerful. It will change your life.
One more thing, we're also going to be running a series on how to practically apply Abraham's blessing to your life, so you could actually begin to walk in the wealth of Abraham's blessings. Go to the International Academy of Spiritual Gifts. That's coming up as well.
You do not want to miss it. I'm telling you. I said it before, but I'll say it again. Be sure and do these things. And we speak shalom over you and your household. We thank you for being with us. And thank you again, Zane. I appreciate your time and
it's my pleasure.
Energy and your teaching and all that you're doing
to be here.
Share the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea.
I'm humbled to be here. Blessings and much love to all.
Yeah, good night.